All right. President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin squared off in a secure video call yesterday for more than 2 hours. And at the forefront of the talks was Ukraine, which Russia appears poised to invade as soon as next year. U.S. intelligence officials reportedly have determined that Russia has amassed 70,000 troops near the Ukraine border and has made preparations for a possible invasion early next year. That could involve up to 175,000 troops. During yesterday's call, President Biden reportedly told Putin that the United States and our European allies would respond to such an invasion with strong economic measures. The provision of additional defense material to the Ukrainians and the fortification of NATO allies on the eastern flank. Now, given what happened in Afghanistan earlier this year and what happened in Crimea in 2014, are there any indications that the Biden administration has learned its lessons? Or might we see a repeat of history? With me now to talk about this is FRC's Executive Vice President, retired Lieutenant General Jerry Boykin, who was one of the original members of the U.S. Army's Delta Force. He has spent the last 4 years of his 36-and-a-half-year military career serving as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. General, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Tony. Glad to be with you.
So does the threats of sanctions by the U.S. carry any weight with Russia?
Well, I think it's like everything. The question is the source of that threat credible? And I would say to you that that is very questionable in terms of whether the president is credible in making a threat or a declaration like that. And if you think back, it was only about a year ago that former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates said that Joe Biden had been wrong on all major national security and foreign policy issues in the last 40 years. Now, don't think that the Russians aren't watching that. Don't think that the Russians aren't studying us, because they are. They put a great deal of resources and effort into studying us and knowing our leadership in this country. And when you've got a former Secretary of Defense that makes a statement like that, I think it does not bode well for the credibility of that threat.
General Boykin, you study that region of the world quite thoroughly. Do you think there is a legitimate threat here that Russia would invade Ukraine?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you why. They don't just have troops. They don't just have infantry and armor up there in that staging area. They have artillery, they have air defense, and they have the enablers or the support mechanisms to sustain a battle. So, yes, I think that Putin is very serious here, and I think that this is a very tense situation. Now, what we have to do is we have to provide the lethal material to the Ukrainians and make this a bloody battle. And I want to say that again. We got to make this a bloody battle, because the reason the Russians came out of Afghanistan was because after several years of sending young men home in body bags with no explanation as to why they were dying, the people in Russia really rose up against their own leadership, which was unusual for Russia, as you know. And the same thing has to happen this time. If they invade, it's got to be a bloody battle, and there's got to be a lot of Russians killed and sent home in body bags, because that will get the attention of the people of Russia, and they will not tolerate it.
Now, the counter-demand made by Vladimir Putin was what he calls the encroachment of NATO into Ukraine. Russia has a population problem. Not too many people, too few people to occupy the territory they have. And so we've seen this with Putin trying to create buffers around the Russian homeland. How significant of an issue is that in this issue with Ukraine?
Oh, it's very significant. And look, the Russian birth rate is about 1.3 to 1.6. You can't sustain your society. In fact, if you read Mark Stein's book, America Alone, he says that by the middle of this century, 2050, that Russia will be down to about 83 to 85 million people because of their birth rates. And Putin knows that very well. They can't secure.
So does that make him desperate to move?
It makes him desperate. They are if you think about the size of the country, think of Russia. It's 9 time zones across.
Right.
Depending on how you count.
It's vast. It's huge.
It's huge. You can't secure the borders of a nation like that unless you have buffer states. That's why they went into Georgia. That's why they went into Central Asia, and that's why they gave us such warnings about stay out of Central Asia, stay out of those parts of that part of the world. And yes, this is very serious for the Russians.
So, General Boykin, one of the issues on the table yesterday in discussion was something that was controversial previously with conservatives, the approval of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, gas pipeline to Europe. You know, the Biden administration giving the go-ahead on that a few months back, now saying, well, if you move forward in Ukraine, we're going to work to cut that off with our allies. Yeah,
just think about this. One of the first things that the president did was he rolled back our pipeline. He stopped production on our pipeline, killed a lot of jobs, and then turned around and lifted the sanctions on the Nord Stream pipeline and allowed the Russians. What do you think that said to the Russians? I mean, does that make sense? Does it make sense to anybody? I mean, I don't know how it could make sense to anybody that is objective about this issue. So that that contributes to the credibility or lack of credibility of our president and his resolve to actually stop the Russians from moving into that part of the world in a big way. And I think that his credibility is hurt by this whole issue with Nord Stream.
So, General Boykin, let's say that we see an invasion of Ukraine in the next year. What is at stake for the United States if it does or if it does not respond?
Well, if the United States does not respond, if there was an invasion and the United States does not respond, and I'm not talking about boots on the ground, but I think we should put more NATO forces, more U.S. forces with NATO into places like Poland as a buffer. But if we don't respond, do you think that China might be watching this? Do you think that China might think, well, now is the time for us to go into Taiwan? Because that is, as far as they are concerned, that is their number one objective, is to take Taiwan. And if we let them go in unopposed, they will take Taiwan.
So at this point, we see this as a series of dominoes that fall.
It is. I do. Yes.
This would make this would have a tremendous destabilizing effect upon the entire global landscape.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, when you've got two superpowers that are locked in any kind of conflict, it is not a good thing, and it impacts the entire global economy, and it impacts the other nations.
How would this be different from Afghanistan in the 1980s?
Well, in the 1980s, when Russia was in Afghanistan, the United States was actually in there running covert activities against them. I spent a couple of years at the CIA, so
don't tell us too much.
Very familiar with the activities that we ran in there. But we armed the Mujahideen as well.
Right, which we're now
yeah.
dealing with.
Now we're dealing with the Mujahideen with a fresh batch of $83 billion worth of weapons and materiel, which is another thing that destroys the credibility of our president when he goes into talks with somebody that is seasoned and as determined as Vladimir Putin is.
Do you think, General Boykin, that this administration has the will and to respond?
I think that they have the resolve to do what he said he would do with regards to the sanctions.
But will our he talks about those sanctions require international.
They're not going to stop him. They're not going to stop Putin.
But in order to be effective, not only will you have to have the sanctions, but you'll have to have international cooperation. And at this point, given what happened just recently in Afghanistan, will the rest of the world follow, the rest of the West follow the United States?
Will the other NATO nations follow, since we pulled out of there and left them sort of high and dry, if you will, and they had to scramble to get their own people out of there. The question is a good question, and I think that that's one of the long-term setbacks for American foreign policy, is the fact that they don't trust us, and they don't trust our president or this administration, and that's a bad thing at a time like this especially. But look, we need their cooperation, just as you said.
Well, but we have to provide leadership to get it.
We do.
General Jerry Boykin, as always, great to have you on the program. Thanks for your insight.